It's the last week of July 2026, and the story right now isn't just another night of strikes. It's a complete shift in how this war is being fought, because for the first time, the target list isn't just missile bunkers and drone hangars buried under mountains. It's bridges. It's power infrastructure. It's the physical connective tissue that lets Iran's military move people, fuel, and equipment from one part of the country to another. And the reason that shift matters so much is because of one single social media post that changed the entire calculus of this conflict. A post that basically told the regime in Tehran that every time it touches a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, something in Iran is going to stop standing. Here's exactly what happened, and why it's become one of the most consequential developments of this entire war. After Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz and launched a wave of missiles and drones at its Gulf neighbors in retaliation for renewed American strikes, following an attack on a merchant vessel that was abandoned in flames by its own crew, the president posted a message that read almost like a standing order rather than a threat. From that point forward, it said, "Anytime the Islamic Republic of Iran shoots at a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, whether by missile, rocket, drone, or any other device or weapon, the United States will bomb and destroy one bridge or power plant. And that includes targets located next to or inside the capital city of Tehran itself." That last part is the piece that should stop you for a second, because Tehran isn't just any city. It's the seat of power. It's where the leadership retreats to. It's the one place the regime has always assumed was politically off limits to this kind of infrastructure targeting. That assumption just got thrown out the window. Stick around, because we're going to walk through exactly which bridges and which pieces of infrastructure have actually been hit, how this new doctrine is playing out in real time, what Iran is threatening to do in response, and why legal experts and humanitarian officials around the world are raising serious alarms about where this kind of targeting could lead. We'll also get into the bigger picture of what this actually accomplishes strategically, because there's a real argument being made on both sides about whether this is smart pressure or reckless escalation. And we'll walk through the full sequence of events that led here, so none of this feels like it's coming out of nowhere. If you find this kind of breakdown useful, drop a like on the video. It genuinely helps more people see coverage that actually explains the reasoning behind what's happening, instead of just repeating headlines. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time, because this story is moving fast and it's not slowing down anytime soon. Let's start with what's actually been hit, because the details here matter more than the rhetoric. Around the port city of Bandar Abbas, which sits right on the Strait of Hormuz and functions as one of the main logistical hubs connecting Revolutionary Guard bases along the coast to the rest of the country, American strikes over a flurry of just 2 days damaged at least 6 separate bridges along with a tunnel. Satellite and state television imagery both confirmed the damage. The stated goal, according to officials familiar with the targeting logic, was to sever the physical links between Revolutionary Guard positions on the coast and the broader military supply network further inland. Another strike hit a railway junction west of the port city, disrupting rail movement in the same corridor. Local residents reported significant traffic backups on the roads that were still passable, a small but telling sign of just how much day-to-day movement in that region actually depends on the exact infrastructure now being targeted. That wasn't an isolated cluster either. Over the broader span of this campaign, strikes in and around Bandar Abbas also hit the offices of the regulatory authority that manages Iran's radio frequency spectrum, effectively disrupting a piece of the country's communications backbone. A maritime communications tower in one of the city's ports took repeated hits over 3 consecutive days before finally being completely destroyed. Another communications tower roughly 75 miles down the coast was also struck. For a stretch of days, communications between the mainland and the islands of Karaj and Keshem were disrupted entirely, though Iranian authorities say they eventually restored those connections by around the 10th day of the renewed campaign. Further to the east, naval and military facilities in Sistan and Baluchistan province, along the Gulf of Oman, also came under fire. And on the 18th, a strike hit a water desalination plant on a peninsula just outside the strait, destroying the pumping stations there and, according to Iranian officials, cutting off water supply to roughly 10,000 nearby residents. That last one sits right at the center of the debate happening right now, because a desalination plant is about as close to purely civilian infrastructure as you can get, even if Iranian officials claim it also fed water to nearby military installations. Think about what that combination actually does to a region logistically, because it's worth sitting with for a second rather than just moving past it as one line item among many. Take out the bridges and the tunnel connecting Bandar Abbas to the interior. Take out the railway junction, handling freight movement along the same corridor. Take out the communications towers, coordinating everything from port operations to military dispatch. And take out a chunk of the local water supply, all in the same general window of time. And you've effectively isolated an entire coastal military and logistics hub from the rest of the country almost simultaneously. That's not random target selection. That's a deliberate, layered effort to cut off one specific region's ability to function as a staging ground for further attacks on shipping in the strait. And it's happening at the same time. Similar patterns are playing out at other coastal points along the waterway. It's worth remembering, too, that Bandar Abbas isn't just any coastal city. It sits at the narrowest and most strategically important point along the entire strait, close enough to the shipping lanes that anything launched from positions around it reaches international waters within minutes rather than hours. That geography is exactly why the Revolutionary Guard has concentrated so much of its anti-ship capability in and around that specific stretch of coastline over the years. And it's exactly why cutting off the roads, rail lines, and communications infrastructure feeding into it carries real operational weight beyond just the symbolic value of knocking down a bridge on camera. Every hour it takes longer to move a missile launcher, a boat crew, or a replacement radar unit into position along that coastline, because the direct route no longer exists, is an hour of reduced capability to actually threaten a passing tanker. And that's the entire military argument this doctrine rests on. Tehran itself, notably, has only been hit twice throughout this stretch of the campaign, which is a sharp contrast to the earlier phase of the broader conflict when the capital was pounded by hundreds of strikes, most of them carried out by Israel rather than the United States. One of those 2 strikes in the capital area hit the Kosher military complex, one of Iran's primary missile production facilities, located just outside the city. That relative restraint around Tehran up to this point is part of what makes the president's warning so significant. By explicitly naming targets inside or next to the capital as fair game going forward, the threshold that had quietly existed up until now got erased in a single social media post. And this entire doctrine didn't come out of nowhere. It's a direct response to a specific pattern of behavior from Iran. Not long after an earlier ceasefire deal had been reached back in June, Iran began striking commercial ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz again, immediately triggering a new round of tit-for-tat attacks with the United States. By the middle of July, the American military had intensified its bombing campaign in response, and within a day, a blockade on Iranian ports was reimposed. Over the following 2 days of intensified bombardment, the American military said it struck dozens of targets, ranging from air defense systems and coastal radar sites to missile and drone production facilities, launcher positions, and the small fast boats Iran has repeatedly used to harass commercial shipping in the strait. It was only after that renewed intensity that the bridge and power plant doctrine got formally announced, explicitly tying every future Iranian attack on a ship to a specific, named category of retaliatory target inside Iran. The Secretary of State, speaking from an international conference in Manila not long after the announcement, made clear that diplomacy hadn't been abandoned, but that Washington's read on Tehran's intentions had shifted considerably. He said plainly that Iran didn't currently seem serious about reaching a deal, pointing out that commitments made in a memorandum of understanding signed the previous month had already been violated within 2 weeks. That's a pretty direct accusation to make on the record at a major diplomatic gathering, and it set the tone for everything that followed. It's also worth noting where that comment was delivered, because a security-focused meeting of foreign ministers from across Southeast Asia isn't the venue you'd expect for a pointed update on the Iran conflict. But it underscores just how far this dispute over a single waterway has managed to insert itself into completely unrelated corners of international diplomacy. Every major gathering of foreign ministers right now, regardless of the region or the original agenda, seems to end up fielding questions about the Strait of Hormuz and what happens if it stays effectively closed for business. Iran's response came quickly through state media, with an unnamed military source telling one of the country's main state-run outlets that if bridges or power plants inside Iran are targeted, Iran will respond in kind by striking bridges and energy infrastructure belonging to countries in the region where the United States has interests. In other words, Tehran is threatening to widen the infrastructure war outward into the broader Gulf, rather than simply absorbing the hits and hoping the pressure eventually eases. This is also where things get genuinely complicated from a legal and humanitarian standpoint, and it's worth walking through honestly rather than just treating it as a clean military success story, because it isn't one. Bridges, power plants, water treatment facilities, and communications infrastructure are what's known in the language of the laws of armed conflict as dual-use targets, meaning they serve both civilian populations and military logistics at the same time. Striking them can absolutely degrade a military's ability to move troops and supplies, which is the entire rationale behind severing the routes connecting Revolutionary Guard bases in Bandar Abbas to the rest of the country. But it also disrupts daily life for ordinary people who have nothing to do with the regime's decision-making, families who need that water pumping station running, commuters who need that bridge standing, hospitals that need that communications tower functioning to coordinate care. Legal scholars have already gone on record warning that, under certain circumstances, deliberately targeting infrastructure with significant civilian use could rise to the level of a war crime under international law, particularly when the military value of a given strike is limited relative to the civilian harm it causes. That's not a fringe opinion. It's a mainstream reading of how the laws of armed conflict are supposed to work. And it's exactly the kind of criticism this bridge and power plant doctrine is going to keep attracting the longer it continues. The legal framework at the center of this debate generally comes down to two connected principles that show up again and again in international humanitarian law: distinction and proportionality. Distinction requires that attacks be directed only at legitimate military objectives, rather than civilian objects. And proportionality requires that even when a target does have genuine military value, the expected harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure can't be excessive relative to the concrete military advantage anticipated from the strike. A bridge that's actively being used to move Revolutionary Guard equipment toward the coast has a plausible claim to military value under that framework. A water desalination plant serving 10,000 residents has a much harder time clearing that bar unless there's a specific, demonstrable military use tied directly to it. That's precisely the gray zone this entire campaign keeps operating in, target by target. And it's why you're seeing such a sharp divide between officials defending the strikes as necessary, interdiction of military supply lines, and humanitarian observers describing at least some of them as crossing a line the laws of war were specifically designed to prevent. There's a more specific and more painful example that's worth being honest about here too, because it happened earlier this year and it shaped a lot of the current debate. Back in the spring, an American and Israeli strike hit the B1 highway bridge in Karaj, just west of Tehran, a major highway link that had been described at the time as the tallest bridge in the Middle East and had only recently been inaugurated. The first strike killed at least 2 people. Then, according to reporting from Iranian state media, once first responders had arrived on scene to help the injured, a second strike hit the same location in what's known as a double tap. Iranian officials said that combined sequence killed 8 people and wounded more than 90, with local authorities saying many of the victims were civilians who had gathered in the area below the bridge to celebrate a traditional outdoor festival. That's an outcome nobody should wave away or explain past. Whatever the military justification was for targeting a supply route the bridge represented, the human cost of that particular strike was severe, and it's precisely the kind of incident that fuels the legal criticism this entire doctrine now faces. The double tap pattern specifically, striking the same location a second time once rescuers have already arrived, is one of the most heavily criticized tactics in modern warfare, precisely because it puts first responders directly in harm's way and can transform a single strike with a defensible military rationale into an event with a dramatically higher civilian death toll. Any honest breakdown of what's happening right now has to hold both of those things at once: the real military logic behind severing supply lines, and the real civilian cost when that logic gets applied to infrastructure that ordinary families depend on every single day. Iran, for its part, hasn't stayed passive through any of this. State television has reportedly claimed that its military has already identified a list of bridges inside countries allied with the United States in the region as potential retaliatory targets, a direct mirror of the American doctrine now aimed back outward. And on the battlefield itself, Iran has continued intensifying strikes not just on shipping in the Strait, but on Gulf countries that host American military installations, an escalation that has already cost American lives. The Department of War confirmed the death of an American service member believed to have been killed in action during an enemy attack on a base in Jordan, one of several confirmed American casualties from this renewed phase of the conflict. Those are not abstract statistics. Those are individual service members who won't be coming home, and it's worth pausing to acknowledge that every escalation on this list carries a human cost on both sides of it, not just the side that makes for more dramatic strike footage. It's also worth stepping back and recognizing just how quickly the human cost has climbed on both sides since this renewed phase of fighting began. What started in mid-July as a dispute over a single tanker being struck and abandoned by its crew has, within the span of about 2 weeks, expanded into confirmed American military deaths, thousands of Iranian civilians and protesters reportedly killed by their own government, and a growing list of infrastructure strikes with their own documented civilian casualties. That's an extraordinarily steep escalation curve for such a short window of time, and it's exactly the kind of trajectory that makes military planners and diplomats on every side increasingly nervous about where the ceiling actually is, because right now there doesn't appear to be one. The conflict has also started pulling in actors well beyond Iran itself, which is exactly the kind of spillover risk that tends to get less attention than it deserves. Yemen's Houthi movement, long aligned with Tehran, has declared a naval blockade targeting Saudi-linked vessels in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the other major choke point that regional shipping relies on whenever the Strait of Hormuz becomes too dangerous to use. The Houthis claim their actions are retaliation for Saudi restrictions on Yemen and a recent attack on an airport inside Houthi-controlled territory. and they've already claimed responsibility for striking Saudi oil tankers in the Red Sea. That means two of the most important maritime choke points in the entire global economy are now simultaneously under threat from the same broad coalition of Iranian-aligned actors, which is a genuinely unusual and serious situation for global shipping and energy markets to be navigating at the same time. Think about what that actually means for a shipping company trying to route a tanker from the Gulf toward Europe or Asia right now. Under normal circumstances, if the Strait of Hormuz becomes too dangerous, the alternative is to route further south and west toward the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Red Sea corridor instead. That's traditionally been the backup plan. With the Houthis now actively targeting vessels in that exact corridor as well, shipping companies are effectively losing their fallback option at the same time their primary route is under fire, and that's precisely the kind of squeeze that sends insurance premiums and freight rates climbing across the board, regardless of whether a given ship ever actually gets hit. Independent monitoring groups that track shipping lane safety have been logging a steady stream of incident reports across both waterways simultaneously, something that hasn't really happened at this scale before in this conflict. Now, here's where the president's rhetoric gets even more pointed, because at a campaign-style event held at a high school in Georgia, he went further than the formal bridge and power plant doctrine and made a broader claim about America's overall leverage in this conflict. He argued that if you combine American oil production with output from Venezuela, the two countries together account for roughly 62% of the world's oil market. And on that basis, he claimed the United States doesn't actually need the Strait of Hormuz or any particular choke point to sustain its own energy needs. He was careful to add, though, that the campaign against Iran isn't really about the strait at all in his framing. It's about preventing Iran from ever acquiring a nuclear weapon. He also made a striking claim about the human cost of the unrest happening inside Iran itself, saying the regime has killed more than 52,000 of its own protesters over the past 4 months alone. That number, if accurate, represents a staggering internal crackdown happening in parallel with the external war, and it reinforces a pattern that's become impossible to ignore throughout this entire conflict. A government willing to inflict massive violence on its own population in order to preserve its grip on power, even while that same government's military infrastructure gets dismantled piece by piece from the outside. So let's talk honestly about what this bridge and power plant doctrine is actually trying to accomplish, separate from the moral and legal debate around it. Strategically, the logic is fairly straightforward. Iran has spent years treating attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz as a relatively low-cost way to apply pressure and extract concessions, because for a long time there wasn't a clear, immediate, painful consequence attached to doing so. This new doctrine is designed to change that calculation entirely by making the cost of every single attack on a ship immediate, specific, and visible. It's not a vague promise of eventual retaliation somewhere down the line. It's a direct one-to-one linkage. You hit a ship, a bridge, or a power plant inside Iran gets hit back, full stop, no exceptions, and now that includes targets inside the capital itself. From a pure deterrence standpoint, that kind of clarity is exactly what's supposed to make an adversary think twice before pulling the trigger on the next attack, because there's no ambiguity left about what happens next. There's a useful way to think about why this specific kind of doctrine gets adopted instead of just continuing to strike military targets the way the campaign had been doing for weeks already. Purely military targeting, hitting missile bunkers, drone storage, radar sites, air defense batteries, absolutely degrades a military's fighting capability over time, but it doesn't necessarily change the political calculation of the people making decisions in Tehran, because those losses are largely invisible to the general population and framed by state media as heroic resistance rather than actual defeat. Infrastructure is different. A bridge that used to carry traffic and now doesn't is visible to everyone who used to drive across it. A power outage is felt by every household on that section of the grid, regardless of political affiliation. The theory behind this kind of pressure campaign is that visible, tangible disruption to daily life creates a different, more immediate kind of political cost for a regime than purely military losses do, one that's much harder to spin away on state television. But deterrence theory only works if the other side is actually rational about weighing costs and benefits, and there's a growing body of evidence throughout this entire conflict suggesting that Iran's leadership isn't making decisions purely on that basis anymore. A government that's already executing protesters by the thousands, a government whose foreign minister has openly embraced an eye for an eye doctrine rather than looking for an exit ramp, a government whose military spokespeople have said publicly that Iran would bomb its own territory rather than allow it to be occupied. That's not a government behaving like a rational actor, carefully calculating costs against benefits. It's a government that has decided this conflict is existential, and existential fights tend to escalate rather than de-escalate, because neither side believes it can afford to be the one that backs down first. That's really the honest tension sitting underneath this entire infrastructure campaign right now. On one hand, you have a genuine military logic behind targeting the physical connective tissue that lets Iran's forces move and communicate, especially around a strategically vital choke point like the Strait of Hormuz. Severing the road and rail links between Revolutionary Guard positions on the coast and the rest of the country isn't just symbolic. It makes it materially harder to resupply, reposition, and coordinate forces in exactly the region where this entire conflict keeps flaring up. On the other hand, you have a mounting civilian toll, credible legal warnings about the line between legitimate military targeting and something closer to collective punishment, and a regime in Tehran that shows every sign of escalating right back rather than backing down. Both of those things are true at the same time, and pretending otherwise, in either direction, misses what's actually happening on the ground. There's also a longer historical pattern worth noting here, because this isn't the first time this exact threat has been made. Earlier in the year, back in the spring, the same basic ultimatum was issued more than once, warnings that power plants and bridges across Iran would be hit if the Strait of Hormuz wasn't reopened within a set deadline, warnings that were sometimes delivered in blunt, unmistakably frustrated language. One earlier version of that warning gave Iran 48 hours to reopen the waterway or face a new round of attacks targeting power plants, starting with the largest one first. Another version, delivered just days later, promised what was described as a single day combining both power plant strikes and bridge strikes into one coordinated wave. Those earlier ultimatums did lead to real strikes, including the Karaj bridge attack we already talked about, and Iran's response at the time was to threaten a complete and indefinite closure of the strait until the destroyed power plants were rebuilt. That back and forth has essentially been the shape of this entire relationship for months now. A cycle of ultimatum, strike, retaliation, counter-ultimatum, repeating itself with the specific targets shifting, but the fundamental dynamic staying remarkably consistent. What's different this time is the scope of the standing order. Instead of a one-time deadline tied to a specific demand, this latest version functions as an open-ended policy, automatically triggered by any future attack on shipping, with no expiration date attached to it, which fundamentally changes the incentive structure on both sides going forward. Zooming out to the bigger picture, the real question hanging over all of this is whether an infrastructure for infrastructure exchange like this actually produces a stable outcome or just locks both sides into an escalating cycle that eventually reaches a point neither side can walk back from. If Iran genuinely stops targeting commercial shipping because the cost of doing so has become too high and too immediate, then this doctrine will have functioned exactly the way deterrence theory says it should, trading a painful but limited set of infrastructure strikes for the restoration of safe passage through one of the most important waterways on the planet. But if Iran instead follows through on its threat to widen the target list outward into allied countries in the region, or if internal pressure inside Iran pushes hardline factions to double down rather than seek an exit, then what started as a narrow, proportional response mechanism risks becoming the spark for a much broader regional conflict involving multiple countries and multiple new fronts that have nothing directly to do with the original dispute over shipping lanes. What happens over the next few weeks is going to tell us a lot about which direction this actually goes. Does Iran quietly stop attacking ships once the cost becomes too visible and too immediate to ignore, the way deterrence is supposed to work in theory? Or does the regime, backed into a corner both externally by military pressure and internally by its own brutal crackdown on protesters, decide that doubling down is safer than backing off, even if that means widening this war into new countries and new categories of targets? Either path carries enormous consequences, not just for the people living near the bridges and power plants currently in the crosshairs, but for global energy markets, for shipping routes that the entire world economy depends on, and for the families of every service member on every side of this conflict who are waiting to see whether the next phone call is good news or the worst news imaginable. It's also worth thinking about how this doctrine interacts with everything else already happening in this war at the same time, because none of this is unfolding in isolation. The blockade on Iranian ports is still fully active, still redirecting and inspecting vessels tied to Iranian shipping, still squeezing oil revenue that the regime depends on to fund everything from its missile program to the security forces carrying out the crackdown at home. Nightly strikes against military infrastructure, missile bunkers, drone storage, air defense sites have continued in parallel with this new infrastructure targeting, meaning Iran is currently absorbing pressure on at least 3 distinct fronts simultaneously: its economy through the blockade, its conventional military capability through ongoing strikes, and now its civilian-facing infrastructure through this new bridge and power plant doctrine. Stack all 3 of those together and you start to understand why officials in Washington keep describing Iran as increasingly cornered, and why officials in Tehran keep describing the same situation in almost the opposite language. as evidence that the regime is being unfairly besieged and has no choice left but to fight back with everything available to it. The uncomfortable truth is that both of those framings can be simultaneously accurate, depending on where you're standing. From a purely military and economic standpoint, Iran genuinely is running out of runway. Its stockpiles depleting, its revenue shrinking, its infrastructure fraying under sustained pressure on multiple fronts at once. And from a political and psychological standpoint inside Tehran, a regime facing exactly that kind of runway. Shrinking often becomes more dangerous rather than less, because leadership with nothing left to lose domestically sometimes calculates that dramatic escalation abroad is the only remaining path to survival at home. That combination, a regime running low on conventional options, but not remotely low on the willingness to use whatever remains, is exactly the scenario that keeps analysts across the political spectrum genuinely uncertain about where this actually ends. What do you think happens from here? Do you think this bridge and power plant doctrine actually forces Iran to back off attacks on shipping? Or do you think it just pushes the regime toward widening this conflict even further? Let us know what you think down in the comments. We read through every one of them, and it genuinely shapes what we dig into next. If this breakdown helped you actually understand the reasoning and the real stakes behind what's happening right now instead of just the surface level headline, do us a favor and hit like on this video, leave a comment with your take, and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss the next update the moment something shifts. This story is moving fast. The stakes keep climbing, and we're going to keep tracking every part of it as it develops. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.